Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for Quick Bites. This is where we do snap analysis of news events in the world of food policy. And I'm really delighted that Professor Mike Rayner is with me today. Many of you will know Mike. He's at Oxford University. He's also the chair of Sustain, and also very relevant to this conversation. He was one of the founding originators of the research and underpinnings of the first nutrient profile model. We'll get into it, we'll touch on that later, but that's obviously particularly relevant at the moment because since we actually set up this webinar on the US dietary guidelines and discussing that, we've also had published the updated nutrient profile model by the government. So we might sneak in a little bit of a discussion on that towards the end of our conversation on the US dietary guidelines, making the most of having Mike's wisdom at the table. So thank you for joining us, Mike. It's great to have you here. We're going to talk about the US dietary guidelines, which are recently come out and have caused quite a lot of conversation from multiple angles. I think this sort of feels like a very curious mix of things have sort of appeared in this new set of dietary guidelines. Tell us just, what's your kind of top line take on them, Mike?
Well, they're interesting. I'm interested in the effect they're going to have on our own food-based dietary guidelines in the UK, aka the Eatwell guide, and if that was to be revised, whether that would take into account some of the things that the American guidelines are doing. The problem I have with them is twofold, really. One is I think the process by which they have been developed has been all over the shop and not sufficiently evidence-based to my way of thinking. The other thing I think about them is that they take absolutely no account of environmental sustainability, and increasingly we're being urged. We have to think about not just foods that are good for our health, but foods that are good for the planet as well. So those are my two criticisms. I mean, there are some good things about them in a way. One of the good things is that they take seriously the issue of food processing, for example. So they're one of the first few sets of dietary guidelines around the world which mentions highly processed foods. And I think the evidence is increasing around the importance of processing when it comes to health. And I think that's a good thing in the sense that they have taken more account of food processing than other dietary guidelines, including our own.
Right. And I think, while we're sort of talking about let's start with those positives. I also thought the kind of website, which is intended to be more kind of citizen facing, if you like, was pretty engaging and very, very different, I would say, to how our dietary guidelines look online, and potentially a bit more helpful in helping everyday people kind of work out what they're trying to say. Did you agree?
Yeah, I agree. 20 years ago, I worked for an organization called the Coronary Prevention Group, and we tried to produce dietary guidelines which made the food look delicious. And I think, that's one thing you've got to do in presenting food dietary guidelines, to talk about the positives about food and make the foods look tasty as well as healthy. And the American guidelines website certainly does that, I think.
Right. Yeah. And sort of talk about this term of sort of real food. I imagine that's perhaps controversial in some circles. I quite like it because it does capture something about this point about processing that, or sort of the highly industrially produced foods and the extent to which they have moved us so far from this sort of original ingredients, if you like. But maybe let's talk a little bit, just to orientate people as to the sort of headlines from the House. So the triangle is an interesting presentation. Do you want to just talk people through what that looks like and where it throws up kind of questions and challenges, I guess, from.
Well, it's a triangle. It's not a pyramid. It's an inverted pyramid and there have always been problems with pyramids, actually, because people thought that things at the top of the pyramid were the good, and actually generally they were bad. So to invert the pyramid does make some sense, that you put the good things at the top and not at the bottom. So I'm happy with that. it doesn't show any bad foods in the pyramid at all. Really, it's all good foods, and I worry, that there's a big stake at the top. So basically, the guidelines are very keen on promoting consumption of protein in general and meat in particular. So it looks as if, I think, from the graphic alone, without the words, that it's encouraging people to eat a lot more meat than they should be.
Well, and I think, yeah, the graphic definitely suggests that sort of more beef than bananas has been what I've seen people talking about.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
right.
And also a heavy focus on dairy, right? I
And
mean,
dairy,
it's
yes, I should say that.
and am I right in saying I think there's also been now this big dusting off of the milk moustache campaign. I've seen interesting photos of
Mhm.
Trump on the line with a milk moustache and others, and it seems to be really, really promoting the meat and dairy sector significantly.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, obviously,
That
there's environmental. We'll come on to the environmental side of that in a moment, but from a health perspective, there are also risks here, right?
well, not in the words around the guide or the booklet that goes with the graphic, they say talk about healthier fats, and then within those healthier fats they include butter and beef tallow. Strangely, so basically they don't go quite as far as saying cut down on animal fats, but are really promoting animal fats. They still got a 10% saturated fat guideline within the text. So they're still keeping to that idea that we should be eating less than 10% of our get 10% of our energy from, or less than 10% of our energy from saturated fat, and that is good. But I don't see how you can do that while eating more beef and dairy, if you see what I mean. So there's contradictory messages in the guidelines as well, just illogical messages, really. How can we cut down on saturated fat and at the same time eat more beef and dairy?
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. And let's move on then to the environment side. As you said, it sort of pays no attention to that. Obviously, the US is already a big consumer. I haven't looked at the exact stats in comparison to where the UK is, but I'm assuming they're eating more meat than we are per
So
capita.
yeah,
And we're in the top 10, I think. I can't remember the exact figure. We've got it in our meat facts report, but we're one of the biggest consumers worldwide ourselves per capita. So I guess the question is this an attempt to get people to switch from more kind of highly processed meat to more steaks and so forth, or is this actually about overall an intention to even drive up further meat consumption? Do you have a sense of that?
I, I think it's I think it's deliberately encouraging meat consumption, yes, and saying that there's nothing to worry about in meat consumption and everything to be gained from more meat consumption, particularly fresh meat. Where, of course, from a planetary perspective, processed meat's better for the planet than fresh meat, because it's processed foods in general have some benefits for the planet, as opposed to fresh foods, they last longer, etc. And there's less meat in a processed meat sausage than there is in a steak. So actually, we have to be careful here about trade-offs, I think, between what's good for the planet and what's good for health. And there's certain foods which are definitely good for the planet but bad for health, and vice versa. So we need to be worried about those trade-offs. But basically, these guidelines do not even acknowledge there's a problem with environmental sustainability when it comes to diets, which I think is certainly worrying. But that's going backwards in my view.
Mm. So just talk us through the process. You said also the other problem that's been with them has been the process of development. So talk us through how it's been done historically and what happened this time around.
Well, I've always admired the American process by which they developed dietary guidelines and have advocated for that in the UK. So, for example, they've got a statutory commitment to revising them every 5 years. So every 5 years they have to produce the American government has to produce new dietary guidelines, and we're now due. And also, what they've also laid down in statutes or regulations processes by which the dietary guidelines should be revised, which we don't have. Again, we don't have in the UK, and that's been good too, because it means that they've taken into account much more of recent evidence than other countries, and so that it's been a good process. Normally, convening a committee, again a statutory committee, to review the evidence in particular ways. So, for example, they've obviously done a lot of systematic reviews. This time, they did all those systematic reviews, but then the Secretary of State for Health and the Secretary of State for Agriculture have the final word about the dietary guidelines, so they can overtake the dietary guidelines. They can overrule the dietary guidelines committee or not, as they so choose. Mostly in the past, they haven't done that. They've taken on board the recommendations of the committee, but this time they commissioned some new evidence, rather scrattily produced, in my view, to come up with their new guidelines, and these emphases on fresh and real foods, and these emphases on highly processed foods, and to avoid the highly processed foods. That didn't come out of the committee so much as come out of the politicians.
Interesting. And in terms of the evidence that they've produced, this sort of separate evidence generation process that you said hasn't been presented terribly well, what is the evidence misinterpreted in your view, or is it I mean, what's the kind of evidence foundation for what they've actually proposed?
Because I haven't looked at it in a lot of detail. I mean, there are criticisms of that new evidence that they produce. It's sort of a bolt-on to what's been done before by the committee, as far as I can tell. So what was done by the committee was fine, but what was done sort of hurriedly over the last few months, really, by these extra researchers, I think needs a lot more delving into, really, to see what's going on there. And I'm not sure that the standards of systematic review have been upheld to any large degree.
Right.
I confess I need to look at that evidence in more detail. It's more I'm more worried about the process itself. I mean, they shouldn't have had to do that extra evidence gathering, and they should have really gone with the views of the expert committee that had been set up to actually review the evidence.
So let's just remind. So you've set out why the process in the US has historically been, a really good model. Let's compare it to our process here in the UK. We were just checking when we were coming on before online, the Eatwell guide, which is our kind of equivalent, I guess, of the US dietary guidelines, was last updated in 2016. What's the process for developing them? Is that the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition that advises on them? Is it a similar process of a statutory committee like that?
Well, in 2000, there's no written down process for the revision of the Eatwell guide in the UK. It's really at the whim of the DHSC, really, to if they wanted to propose a revision, they obviously had to get ministerial approval and so forth, but that it will be at their suggestion, and there's nothing in law or even custom, really, to suggest when it should be revised. Last time it was revised because the second report on sugars and carbohydrates had just come out, and so the new recommendations around free sugars and around fiber were used as a reason and for the development of a new guide. And indeed, the proportions of the pie chart in the case of the Eatwell guide did change because of the new second recommendation. So I suppose DHSE could say, well, there haven't been any dietary recommendations recently, we don't need to revise them. But I think that's rather blind to, for example, the issue of ultra processed foods, which is obviously bubbling up in the public discourse. And I think it would be wise of DHSE to set in process a revision of the guide to incorporate new thinking around foods, such as processing is clearly becoming more salient in people's minds, if nothing else, and it should be taken more account of in the UK dietary guidelines. But can I just say about dietary guidelines, they're not just really for individuals. They're for actually, more importantly, in my mind, is their role in policy making when it comes to food. The American guidelines have a statutory role in things like school meal guidelines and the SNAP program, their food stamp programs. We don't have that same sort of tie up between our dietary guidelines and policy in the UK, but I think that would be a good thing to do as well, to make sure that school meal guidelines by statute were in line with the Eatwell guide.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and one which I hope, if we are, some of those online may know, one of the things we are really developing our thinking on is a proposition for some primary legislation around food to really set out the direction of travel for policy development over the coming decade, so that we avoid this kind of feeling of constant reset each time we have a new government, but we can actually create the ambition, set out the ambition. And one of the things which I would hope we could incorporate into that is for the dietary guidelines to have a more deliberate, you do need to pay attention to those dietary guidelines when you're developing policy in public procurement, nutritional safety net programs, our equivalent of SNAP in the US, and so forth. I mean, and beyond potentially as well. And it seems to me like there's a sort of tremendous opportunity there to give dietary guidelines more power, I guess, in as at the moment, sort of a pie chart sitting on an NHS website doesn't feel like it really is leveraging the power that it ought to have in terms of
entirely agree.
Steering policy. Yeah. But let's just go back to the environmental point, because our Eatwell guide has, as I understand it, has never historically intended to factor in sustainability in its revision, the past revision. Am I right in thinking that wasn't a factor deliberately? Yeah.
Well, the 2016, there was some deliberation about whether it should incorporate environmental concerns. What was good about our guide is actually it involved this thing called optimization modeling, which actually the Americans don't do, which gives you a way of dividing foods into groups and then giving information to policymakers and consumers about eating more or less of certain groups. So it tells you precisely how much meat you should be eating for an ideal diet, which actually the Americans don't do. And so, but in that modeling process, this optimization modeling process, we didn't incorporate environmental constraints. We could have incorporated greenhouse gas emissions and land use, water use, etc., but we didn't. There was some checking after the event to look at whether the diet proposed by the Eatwell Guide should be was environmentally sustainable or not, and that was done by the Carbon Trust, and that shows that it generally was. But it wasn't an intention behind the guide, or even part of the modelling for the guide. To take into account environmental considerations. And again, that should happen too. And countries are beginning to think more about that, incorporating environmental considerations into their food-based dietary guidelines.
Which countries would you say are sort of furthest ahead in that?
Some of the Scandinavian countries and the Dutch, Netherlands are seriously trying to incorporate environmental considerations into their guidelines. And again, that will be around meat and dairy, really, eating less meat and dairy fundamentally.
Yeah. So that, I would imagine that would be a little challenging for DHSC. Would have to kind of team up with another government department, right? Perhaps get the advice of the Climate Change Committee or something to try and achieve that dual objective.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, with food-based dietary guidelines in the UK, they've always checked with the Ministry of Agriculture at the time. So even we developed the first balance of goods health back in 1990, something like that. My brain is going for dates. But in those days, the Department of Health would check their guidance with the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries and Food, and that to me is reasonable because I said it before, it's not just guidance for consumers, but it's guidance for food policy in general that we need food-based dietary guidelines.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think the long and the short of that is our Eatwell guide is probably overdue a refresh and a huge opportunity to have a look at it across both delivering both health goals and environmental goals, particularly as many of those environmental goals are set out in law anyway through, the carbon budgets and so forth, and where we've got, specific uh, ambitions around dietary shift in order to be able to stick to those carbon budgets that have been set out. So this sort of
Yes.
alignment of policy across different parts of government can be captured in that process of updating the UK dietary guidelines. I'm interested in just one. I mean, this perhaps feels that maybe a little niche point, but do you think that the role there's a purpose for dietary guidelines in helping to guide policy decisions that we've just discussed, and then there's a purpose for dietary guidelines as being something which is useful for citizens. Do you think the substance behind them is all one in the same thing, or do you think actually these are actually different outputs, obviously, that need to be coherent with one another, but they can't serve one thing can't serve both purposes?
I think they're difficult to do both properly. For example,
Yeah.
in the Eatwell Guide, we do have guidance behind the guide for all sorts of different, well, 120, I think, food groups, and that would be difficult to show in a pie chart with any comprehensibility. So I think there for guidance for the public, you or consumers, you need to be more comprehensible than you need to be guidance for policymakers. But that isn't so. There is a bit of a trade-off there. I think there's also an issue about um, whether you're trying to get people to eat an ideal diet or a better diet than they're eating at the moment sort of diet. And the Eat Well guide is an ideal diet and it looks extreme. So, for example, it recommends, I think, more than 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day. It's 7 portions of fruit and vegetables a day. Given that we're not even managing to eat the five, it seems a bit anomalous that we should be telling people in the food guide to eat seven. So I think I've argued recently, I think sort of makes sense that we should have an interim food guide, really. So a more practical one that you might be able to meet in a few years' time, or rather, because you're never going to meet the Eat Well guide tomorrow. It's too far away from what people are eating at the moment. So yes, so a long answer to the fact that I think we probably do need slightly different but coherent guides for policymakers and for public. But we also need an ideal diet and also a target diet for the next 2 or 3 years, if you like.
Yeah, that's really helpful distinction, where you might sort of put the optimal diet in the kind of long-term policy frame
Mm,
context and the
yeah,
more practical stuff for day to
exactly.
day. These are the small shifts you can make that get
Yeah,
you on the journey kind of thing.
because people have
Yeah,
criticized
interesting. I want,
Eat Well Guide for being too ideal, and indeed it is too ideal, really.
yeah, yeah, yeah. One final point on the US dietary guidelines is a point really around equity,
Mm,
recognizing the very high levels of poverty in the US, as we have here in the UK. And it struck me looking at the website and so forth, is that this doesn't feel achievable for
no.
very many people who are on a low income. I mean, do you think, what's your view on that?
Right. We talked about incorporating considerations of environmental sustainability in food guides, and I do think, to some degree at least, you must incorporate issues of practicality. And by practicality, I also include income. If you're portraying an ideal diet which is so far away from people's ability to pay for such a diet, then that's crazy. You've got to um, produce guidance for the public which takes into account their financial circumstances as much as anything else. And I'm not quite sure how you do that. I don't want to produce separate guides for poor people versus rich people, but there is something in that, if you see what I mean. It sounds a bit awful to say that, but but also I think you just got to bear in mind here the processing food debate comes into play. A lot of processed foods are cheaper than unprocessed foods, as we know, and therefore, really, you sort of you can't just dismiss processed foods
Mm.
as being out with the guide, really, if you like.
Yeah, yeah, completely. I think that's really important point, Ed, where you've got this ginormous differential between sort of normal bread in the supermarket and
Mm.
bread that might be sort of
Mm.
not highly processed, if you like. Huge price differential. Okay, I'm going to sneak in this final question about the nutrient profile model, since you are the expert on it, and I'm sure many of those listening will have started to pick up on some of the responses to the nutrient profile model from the food industry in particular, and some of the concerns which have been flagged up in the press. The one that seems to be uppermost in those concerns is how to measure free sugar, recognizing that as I understand it, the new model requires that in order to be able to classify foods and give them a score.
Yeah.
Do you think that concern is fair? What's your view on it?
Um, I think it's reasonable, but it's not fair. Um, I mean, I think it hides really the hides the really thing the food industry don't like about it. It's stricter, more tougher than the old model. So the thresholds for sugars make the model stricter, and fewer foods pass, particularly high sugar foods. Fewer high sugar foods pass the new model rather than the old model. So I think that's their real concern, and certainly the concern that I've heard, because they've reformulated all their products and now they've got to reformulate them again. Well, tough, really. That was always the idea.
Mhm.
This isn't a statutory target. But with regard to free sugars, I think it's fairly fair, but I still don't think it's that fair. I mean, the Americans have got food labeling regulations with free sugars on them now, so that you have to put free sugars on their nutrition facts panels. So it is quite possible, with a bit of willingness really on the part of participants, to come up with rules for measuring free sugar, which I mean, it's slightly more complicated than, obviously more complicated than measuring total sugars, but I don't think it's entirely fair that it should block the whole thing. And free sugars are what we should be worrying about, not total sugars. It's the added sugars in foods that are of the major health concern, not the naturally occurring sugars in fruit and vegetables, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, you heard it here. We now, and I think the other thing to kind of bear in mind when people are hearing about the nutrient profile model, of course, is that it has well, the next stage of the process is for the government to consult on its application in the various pieces of legislation which currently use it. So the advertising restrictions, the restrictions on promotions, the location-based promotions, as well as the volume-based promotions. So that step hasn't happened yet. But I think the other point to bear in mind is that it's easy to sort of hear from some of the criticisms that there's a suggestion that in some way this classification is going to ban those products that fall below the line. Of course, it's not at all. The intention is rather
Mm.
to align, at most it would be a restriction on the promotion and advertising of those
Yeah.
products, rather than anything else, so they can still be produced. Obviously, that will create its own driver towards reformulation, which is what's intended. And also potentially those sort of nudges in store, etc. So anyway, well, I think it's important to bear that in mind, because if you're not close to it, it
Yes. No, I agree.
sometimes can be easily misinterpreted.
Yes, the nutrient profiling model doesn't ban any foods whatsoever. I mean, it just bans the advertising of certain foods in certain circumstances, or helps with that legislation to decide which food should be prohibited from being advertised in certain situations. That's all it does. It doesn't say these are out. These foods should never be eaten. I mean, obviously, I like chocolate, and chocolate won't be advertised on TV anymore. Hopefully, but that doesn't mean stop me eating chocolate, does it?
Yeah, yeah. On that happy note, thank you, Mike, for joining me. And thank you to everybody for listening in. It's been a really interesting conversation. Watch this space in terms of conversations around dietary guidelines, because we're hoping to keep the conversation going. And please do sign up to the newsletter and the podcast to keep track of what's coming next from the Food Foundation. And have a lovely day. Thank you again, Mike, for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
See you soon. Okay,
Bye.
bye.